Allow me to recount a supernatural experience I had a few years ago at a movie theater in Daipo. I won't divulge the name of this theater, but if you're familiar with Hong Kong, you might recognize the location, or at least where it once stood. It closed down shortly after my unsettling encounter, an incident etched vividly in my memory despite the passage of time. The evening began as a casual outing with a group of friends to catch a movie. After the credits rolled and the lights came on, nature called, prompting me to visit the restroom. The rest of my friends decided to wait outside as I ventured alone into the restroom, a classic old-school setup. Upon entering, one encounters the row of sinks followed by 5 stalls, all occupied. As I joined 2 other ladies patiently waiting an available stall, I couldn't help but overhear the grumblings about the seemingly endless wait. 10 minutes elapsed, and no one emerged from any of the 5 stalls. Oddly, there was complete silence within these enclosures. Frustration mounted among us, and one of the ladies vented her annoyance at the prolonged delay. Suddenly, from the last stall closest to the wall, a deep, eerie woman's voice broke the silence, suggesting, "Why don't you go knock on the doors?" The suggestion was valid, and I wondered why none of us had thought about it before. We decided to act on it collectively, rapping our knuckles on each stall door in turn. No response came from any of them, but when we reached the last stall, the source of the voice, we crouched down to peer underneath the door. To our astonishment, there was nothing there. No feet, no shoes, just an empty space. Our curiosity shifted to sheer terror as we examined the crack around the door, revealing an entirely vacant stall. Panic set in, and all 3 of us made a mad dash for the restroom's front door, our sole means of escape. However, when we tried to handle, it refused to budge, locking us inside. Frantically, we struggled with the door, all the while hearing that eerie woman's laughter emanating from the same stall, a chilling, deep-toned cackle. In our desperation, we screamed for help, our voices piercing the air. It was at that moment that a movie theater employee effortlessly opened the door from the outside as if it had never been locked in the first place. Her reaction was far from shocked. Instead, she simply instructed us to leave, urging us to exit immediately. As we all stumbled out of the restroom, the employee added a cryptic warning. This sort of thing happens here so often, but as you leave, make sure you don't touch any of the curtains. Intrigued, yet puzzled, I didn't initially understand the significance of her warning. However, later on, I learned that these curtains were typical fixtures in old-school movie theaters, adorning the walls. Her caution stemmed from the belief that spirits often lingered along these walls and in the corners of such buildings. In the years that followed, this particular theater met its demise, plagued by numerous inexplicable encounters like ours. It leaves me to wonder if these unsettling incidents played a role in its eventual closure. I would like to share an experience from the year 1985, when I worked a maintenance job. My primary responsibility was overseeing an underground tunnel. The perks were impressive, with favorable hours despite the night shifts, and a monthly salary of about 10,000 HKD, which was quite remarkable at the time. The retirement benefits were appealing, making it a job I cherished. However, one fateful night changed everything. It all began with an observation during one of my night shifts. I noticed an unusual amount of salt residue on the tunnel floor along its walls at a specific location. This indicates a probable leak or crack, allowing seawater to seep through and then evaporate, leaving behind a salt buildup. Such situations necessitate calling in an engineer for inspections. The engineer duly arrived the next night, and my role as part of the maintenance team requires me to accompany him during the inspection. These inspections spanned several nights, commencing at 1 a.m. every night, when we would close off one of the car lanes into the tunnel for safety reasons, and also because the early hours saw minimal traffic. It was during the third night of working with the engineer that things took a bizarre turn. Around 1:20 a.m., with almost no cars in sight, I received a call on my walkie-talkie from the office staff responsible for monitoring the tunnel's cameras. They reported the presence of 5 individuals, 1 man, 1 woman, and 3 children. They were seen entering the tunnel. This was highly unusual since the tunnel is strictly for cars. Pedestrians were prohibited. I was instructed to approach the entrance to ascertain their intentions and to inform them of the restrictions. As I jogged toward the entrance, I caught sight of the group, and to my bewilderment, they veered toward one of the doors meant exclusively for employees. The 3 doors at the tunnel's entrance served different purposes. The first one led to the opposite side of the tunnel. The second one was a repository of electronics and equipment, while the third one led upstairs to the controls for the ventilation system. They chose the third door. I followed them into the third door, distinctly recalling a snapping noise just before they vanished from view. It sounded like the sound of joints popping, only louder. Upon entering the room, I found it devoid of any sign of human presence. The room was relatively small, offering no hiding spots, especially for 5 people. I knew I wasn't hallucinating. The sight was witnessed by my colleagues monitoring the cameras. This marked the first inexplicable incident. Frustration turned into puzzlement as I scoured every inch of the room for clues, but found none. The mystery remained. A few nights later, after completing my rounds, I returned to my office within the tunnel, situated about a 5-minute walk in. The office featured a large window through which I could oversee the entire road and any approaching cars. On this particular night, I dozed off in my chair, anticipating the end of my shift, when all of a sudden, a powerful slap across my face jolted me awake. My senses were on high alert as I looked around for an intruder, but there was no one in sight. The eerie silence of the night amplified the surreal experience. The sensation on my face was all too real, a hot, tingling aftermath of a slap. Bewildered and unnerved, I remained seated, wrestling with confusion. Approximately 30 minutes later, I returned to my interrupted nap and I started dreaming, only to be confronted by the man I had seen earlier. He appeared furious, accusing me of taking his son's leg. According to him, when I chased him days earlier, his son's leg broke off, and he demanded its return. Then, abruptly, I woke up, drenched in sweat, despite the cool night. This nightmarish encounter repeated every time I dozed off during my shift. I tried everything, from bringing a Bible and onions to Buddhist prayers, but nothing alleviated these dreams. Ultimately, these harrowing experiences compelled me to resign. I was consumed by fear. Years later, an older coworker revealed a long-buried secret. During the tunnel's construction phase, some laborers and their families would reside on the site. These individuals were financially distressed or newly arrived immigrants from the mainland. They often slept in tents near the work site, but tragedy struck one evening when a chunk of the tunnel roof collapsed. This large piece of concrete crushed the tent where a laborer and his family slept. The incident remained concealed from all public knowledge. I believe the man in my recurring dream was connected to this tragedy. Since leaving that job, I have never encountered anything similar. In the year 1980, during my reckless youth, I found myself behind bars in a Hong Kong prison. I'm here to recount an eerie experience that left me with no doubt that ghosts are indeed real. I won't reveal the prison's name, but at the time, there was a fellow inmate who had just arrived from Fuzhou, China. His Cantonese was rudimentary at best, which isolated him from most of us. Ironically, it was this language barrier that landed him in prison in the first place. To be honest, I'm not even entirely sure if he committed a crime. As the story goes among the inmates, a misunderstanding during a police search, exacerbated by the language barrier, led to resistance, and he was charged with assault and battery. Just like that, he was sentenced to 6 years. It's essential to remember that this was in the 1980s, a time when corruption was more rampant. He spent about 3 years in prison. Waiting for him on the outside was his wife and 2 young children, who struggled immensely in his absence. Tragically, his wife toiled herself to death, leaving his 2 young children without anyone to care for them. Eventually, they starved to death. When he received the devastating news, he understandably spiraled into madness. A few weeks later, he took his own life by hanging himself in his cell. In prison, when an inmate commits suicide, they reuse the same cell. It was a peculiar practice. When they assigned inmates from Fuzhou to that cell, everything seemed fine. However, they recounted eerie tales of the deceased inmate spirit conversing with them into the night in their native tongue. Yet, when a non-Fuzhou inmate was placed in that room, they emerged the following day battered and bruised, claiming they had been assaulted by the deceased man. Even the correctional officers were aware of this phenomenon. After several such incidents, they tried to keep the cell vacant, utilizing it only as a last resort when all other cells were occupied. I never personally occupied that cell, but every inmate who did had an unsettling experience. It reached a point where they had to call in an exorcist to purify that cell. The exorcist performed the customary rituals, conveying to the tormented spirit that his prison sentence has ended and he is free to reunite with his family. Trapped by his lingering hatred, he had been bound to the place of his demise within that cell.